Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Welcome to our newest special, American Riots, Blue Cities Burning. We've got a great special for you today. We've got a couple guests we'll tell you about in a little bit here. I want to start off here with a book called In Defense of Looting by Vicky Osterweiland. There's Vicky. NPR aired a segment about this book, interviewed the author, and it is bonkers. And we're going to spend some time on it throughout the special as well. But just as an introduction, to justify looting, share a couple quotes here. Looting strikes at the heart of property, of whiteness, and of the police. Looting provides people with an imaginative sense of freedom and pleasure. Riots reveal how without police and without state oppression, we can have things for free, which I guess is true. Now, this is the reason I wanted to share this book. This is really important to understand, and this is a wonderful exercise in thinking how the left thinks, which can be very hard to do. I think the classic example of this is, how could someone be in support of letting criminals out of jail so early, right? And it can look like a lot of different things, right? So there's like the New York Times article, we talked about this a couple weeks ago, where there's a whole New York Times article about how this 25-year-old met a 13-year-old girl online, drove to her house, stopped for condoms along the way, but it turned out to be a child predator sting. And the whole article is about how he's the real victim here. And there was no actual harm to the public. So what are we, it's like, what? Apparently 13-year-old girls, I guess, are no longer considered the public. So you see the left say stuff like this, and you're like, what? So the reason why they say stuff like this is because in their worldview, and Thomas Sowell talks a lot about this in the book, Vision of the Anointed. In their worldview, the criminal is the victim. Now, in your worldview, the victim's the victim, the criminal's the criminal. But in their worldview, the criminal is the victim. They're a victim of circumstance. They're a victim of poverty. They're a victim of oppression. They're a victim of the system. There's no personal responsibility ever, cannot exist. It's always someone else's fault, or if you can't pinpoint someone, it's the system. It's everyone else's fault, right? And it's whatever it takes so that the individual can never be blamed for anything. Therefore, it's cruel to keep this person in jail because they're the real victim. See? I know your brain's like, wait, no, I don't. And in California, where I live, we end up releasing people, and it's happened all across the country, but we release people from jail because of COVID, which makes no sense at all. And then a couple of days later, one of these guys goes and he slits the throat of some guy walking into the bathroom at the beach. But still, the murderer is considered the victim because we as a society didn't do enough to help him, whatever, right? Now, I don't want to get off topic, but the point is that like this looting thing is a real mind bender too. Right? Same way that the criminal is the victim. Here's another one. And this is a quote from her. Property is a crime. So in defense of looting, you can only defend looting if you believe, as this person makes the case, and many progressives do believe, that property is a crime. If property is a crime, then of course it's okay to steal. Not only is it okay, it's virtuous. It's stealing is stopping a crime. Does it make sense? No, it doesn't. It doesn't make sense. But are you like your brain synapses are like short circuit? Like that doesn't make sense. Now, one of our commandments is thou shalt not steal. Pretty simple. But to the left, everything's backwards. To the left, property is a crime. Having property is the problem. Property rights are immoral. It's an aspect of white supremacy. So to the left, it's thou shalt not have property. And it's you shall. It's like literally you. I will, but you shouldn't have property. We'll get to that in a minute. But if having property is the crime, then stealing is a virtue. She says, looting is violent, extreme, femme as blank, a queer birth and a party. The Watts riots, 34 people died, by the way, had a carnivalesque celebratory atmosphere. Whatever, we could break all that down, but it's all just insane. Oh, I should note this. When you buy this book and you open it up, there's a copyright page. The copyright says, the scanning, uploading, and distribution of this book without permission is a theft of the author's intellectual property. If you would like permission to use material from this book, please contact permissions at blah, blah, blah. Thank you for your support of the author's rights. So her property. Don't go stealing her property, of course. All right, let me share this quote. Looting represents a way to solve some of the immediate problems of poverty by creating a space for people to freely reproduce their lives rather than doing so by wage labor. So that's another thing. Wage labor is sinful and immoral. It's wrong. Wage labor is wrong. So if you can find a way to survive and live without wage labor, then you're living a truly virtuous life. See? Now, don't go thinking that you need a political reason to loot. Right? 1977, there was a blackout in New York City. There were a bunch of riots and looting. After that, $300 million in damage. There were 1,000 fires. 34 blocks of Broadway was destroyed. 450 police officers were injured. It was a party, as she would say. The power of the attack on white settler society is seen instead in the broad lawlessness, property destruction, looting, and cop-free zones produced by the riot, and is reflected in the attendant sense of freedom, unity, and radical safety felt by the rioters. So that's it. When the lights went out in New York City and there were 1,000 fires and blocks destroyed and millions of damage and 450 police officers injured, it was freedom, unity, and radical safety. It's all backwards. It's no different than calling Cardi B's song wholesome. That was the first description I heard from the song was that it was wholesome. Okay, it's all backwards. Everything's backwards. Looting, rioting, cop-free zones. It's freedom and radical safety. It's amazing, isn't it? Now, I want to say this is not some mainstream or out of mainstream rogue person. I mean, maybe she in particular is. But how did we go? Her mindset's not. How did we go from no one's allowed to go outside and we're going to cite businesses and there's no funerals and no hospital visits during the COVID lockdowns to overnight, every Democratic mayor letting tens of thousands of people riot and protest after George Floyd? And in a way, it's actually ideologically consistent because freedom was the enemy and property is the crime. Everything's backwards. There's a lot of reasons why people would participate in a riot. We're going to discuss those here in our time together. If you believe that the ends justify the means, which I don't, the left does, then there's no reason not to riot. And get ready for plenty after the election in particular. Everything we've seen so far is just a warm-up. So coming up, we're going to talk with a police officer. We're going to talk about tactics, motivations of the rioters, talk about what it's like to be on the other side, what it's like to be a police officer in the midst of this stuff, and see it up close. We're going to talk about the political ramifications of this for 2020, the Biden riots, how that's going to affect the election. And we'll talk about some historical examples of riots in American history. Have they been a force for positive change in America or not? And don't go calling the Boston Tea Party a riot. It was nothing of the sort. We'll talk about that later, coming up as well. American riots, blue cities burning. Mike Slater, glad you're here. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special American Riots, Blue Cities Burning. I want to go right to our next guest, Dr. Darren Porcher. He's a former NYPD lieutenant. Dr. Porcher, how are you, sir?
I'm good. I'm great. It's great to be here.
Man, good to talk to you, brother. I just want to tell everyone, I asked him before we came on, I said, have you ever been in a riot? He's like, well, I've been a police officer for 20 years. Have I breathed oxygen? So I'm grateful you're here, sir, and I want to get your perspective on what it's like to be in one. So, like, as a police officer, how does it feel? Like you're getting called out to respond to a riot. Where's your head at?
You know, your head is on swivel. First off, you know, I worked in the NYPD for 20 years and I worked all over the city. And I go back to probably the first riot that I have experienced as an officer in the NYPD, which was in the early 90s. We had a riot up in Washington Heights, which is the northern part of Manhattan. There was a situation where there was an officer, Officer O'Keefe, that shot a drug dealer up in Washington Heights. But there was false information that was introduced, which stated that the drug dealer had his hands raised. He was crying for his life, and Officer O'Keefe shot him. This was subsequently false because the witness that made this statement didn't have a vantage point that would have introduced that narrative. So that being said, there was chaos, to say the least, up in Washington Heights. So one of the first things I did was, you know, I go up there, I got the helmet. We refer to it as hats and bats, so to speak. And it was just kind of one of those, it was a unique situation because I was a rookie cop at the time. And then you have bottles and, you know, and bricks that are being thrown at you. But at the same token, you want to maintain that linear vision on the safety of not just yourself, but the individuals that are around you as well. So it was a chaotic state, to say the least. But this is one of the things, and this happened under the purview of the David Dinkins administration here in New York. Riots do subsequently happen, and as a law enforcement officer, you were trained to implement the best practices for the safety of the society that you're there to protect.
What are you looking for in the moment?
What am I looking to go home? I mean, what am I looking for? On a serious note, my main concern is I want to have an understanding of who's closest to me. I want to make sure that my communications are as feasible as possible because I want to know where I am at the time. So if I need to call in an airstrike, when I say an airstrike, meaning if I need additional resources to be brought in, I can give a specific location as to where I am, where I'm being harmed, and what the needs are in that particular instance. So what my needs are is multifaceted and it's dependent upon the situation that you're in. But the primary need in all riots is safety.
When you're telling the story of that not truthful information that was spread that sparked a riot, first of all, that must be super frustrating. But is it also frustrating when perhaps your hands are tied when responding to a riot? And I think we've seen a lot of that going on today too.
You know, I mean, I'm looking at what's happening in places like Portland, Seattle, Chicago, and recently Rochester, New York. The elected officials, I don't think that they've really identified the necessity of police in connection with maintaining a controlled environment. So when I go back to my situation, being a cop in the early 90s, I was a cop from during the crack epidemic in the United States in the South Bronx. So it was a very violent time. And I want to say police commanders had a genuine understanding and they appreciated the fact of what the brutes on the ground were participating in connection with marshaling and public safety for the overwhelming majority of the citizens. So now we fast forward to now, what's not being understood is police chiefs are the interface between elected officials that are designing policy and the boots on the ground, which is the execution phase of the cops on the street. A lot of these elected officials have not understood this, and so they tend to itemize and not organize. When I say itemize, meaning they fit into a silo that's apart from police as opposed to organizing and being part of the structure of elected officials and police. And this is presenting a tremendous problem. And unfortunately, this has happened primarily in cities that are controlled by Democratic mayors. This is a time where the country is under siege. Therefore, it's necessary that we need to coalesce behind law enforcement to introduce the necessity of public safety. And as a result of the failures of elected officials, we have innocent civilians that are dying regularly because of their failure to act. So this is a time where you can either make this moment or miss this moment. And unfortunately, a lot of these elected officials are missing this moment.
So I can't imagine. It must be hard enough to be a police officer in the midst of these riots, but then to know that perhaps in the back of your head that your elected officials don't have your back at all. Like that's even worse. One last question about police officers, then I want to get to the rioters themselves. I see so many videos of police officers standing, right? They're in a line or whatever, and people come up in their face and are screaming at them. And the worst is when you have a black police officer and you have black people screaming like all the worst racist things you can imagine. How do police officers keep their cool? It is amazing how much self-control I've seen out of police officers in the midst of all this. How do you do that?
Well, first, I don't care if it's a black person that's screaming at you if you're a black officer, or if it's a white supremacist. You're still being screamed at by someone, and it creates an uncomfortable environment. You have to take in consideration technological innovations have allowed a universal perspective on what's happening on the ground. So the officer that's being screamed at is somewhat impervious to the fact that this person is just launching a vitriolic campaign against them. And you have to understand, within the purview of the First Amendment, individuals have the right to protest. You may not like it, but at the same token, this is what we signed up for as police officers. And one of the things that we have on our side is time. Police have 8-hour shifts, and then you can move in another 8-hour shift to police in accordance. Where the rioters, they don't necessarily have that luxury. So it's one of these things where time is the entity that's on the side of police officers, and you just wait it out. It sucks, in particular, what's happening right now with the social justice movement. But once again, it goes back to what I stated earlier. This is what you signed up for, and police officers need to be avid professionals.
I hear that, but that's hard, man. You're standing there doing your job, and you are getting screamed at in your face, saying, like, how could you do this? You're the worst person in the world. You're a traitor, blah, blah. How does your anger... I mean, I guess, yeah, intellectually you can be like, oh, it's your First Amendment right, but how does your anger just not go through the roof in that moment?
Well, you know, you gotta train yourself mentally, and you have to look at what an officer deals with. An officer, the average officer is trained 6 months in a police academy, and you take in consideration how you engage people, so your interpersonal communication skills are of optimum importance. A lot of times you just have to wall this stuff off and just say, hey, look, is this person committing to violence? Is this person tearing down structures? If they're not doing that, just let it wind down, and eventually we'll do what we have to do.
Wow, amazing. Okay, let's talk about the rioters themselves. So let's do a little psychology, I guess. Why do people riot? What do they get out of it emotionally? What's the satisfaction that people get out of a riot that makes them want to do it?
Well, I want to say it's multifaceted, and it's also geographic, because what happens in a place like New York is going to be very different than what happens in Portland. Believe it or not, we're speaking of both. We're speaking of a metropolis on both ends, be it Portland and New York. However, the ideology is different. One of the things is social justice, as we see what's happening right now. There can be whatever pin strikes the balloon that causes it to explode, will have people that voice their opinions. And the society that you're in many ways will dictate that, because if people feel as if the society is on their side, meaning the public is on their side, then they're going to be more likely to commit to riotous behavior. But if they feel as if the society is not on their side, meaning the majority of the people are against what they're looking to riot for, then they won't do it. Because in many instances, you have something referred to as street justice. And we see something like that happening now in Portland, whereas you have counter protesters that are coming out. But it's really the ideology that you hold, which is going to dictate if you riot or if you don't riot.
Interesting. And that obviously varies person to person, but on that street justice thing, that probably varies neighborhood to neighborhood, even in some place like New York City. You can probably get away with rioting in some places that you could in others. Yeah, that's interesting.
Right.
Do you think, in your experience, the rioting, is it mostly good people who are there for legitimate reason and they get swept up in it all and it just sort of takes them over? Or in your experience, is it mostly instigators who are out to cause damage?
It's multi-layered. You have, when you refer to instigators, we refer to them as agitators. In many instances, you have agitators as a component of the rioters, but you also have different layers. You have white guilt, for example, that comes into play. You have I see more white people at Black Lives Matter protesting black people because they feel as if that they haven't contributed the way that they felt that they should have. You also have black guilt. You have a lot of black people that come from affluent neighborhoods and feel as if they haven't been a part of the socioeconomically impoverished structure, and now is the time for them to be a part of the fight. So that being said, it goes back to the agitators are one component. You have these people that feel as if they need to have a part in whatever the demonstration is because they haven't been actively a part of the struggle in the past. Coupled with, you have a series of just common citizens that just may have nothing to do, and they say, okay, this is something that I'll conjoin with.
Yeah, that guilt thing. I was just talking to someone about that the other day. That's so true. That's so good. Last question for you, sir. I see a lot of these protests, riots, looting happening in commercial areas. What have you seen it in more residential areas? And what is it? What's stopping people, or what needs to not be there anymore for these riots to really kick up and I think go to the next level, which is to start going into people's homes and attacking more in either the suburbs or even in cities in more residential areas? What would it take to get to that point?
That's a questionable tipping point. I give you an example. Like here in New York, a lot of times you see people that riot in, as you mentioned, the commercial districts and parks and things to that effect. But you have to understand, in many of these locations, people actively reside in these locations. And I give you Lower Manhattan, for example. So what does it take to cause these people to change the dynamic and start breaking into people's homes? That hasn't been something that I've seen on the norm. It's primarily been a public display of outrage. But the personalized and going to someone's home, that has been somewhat limited. However, I have seen instances where rioters have actually gone to the homes of public officials and police chiefs and protested in front of their homes, as we saw most recently in Portland. And it's something similar happened here in New York City, whereas protesters went to the home of the NYPD police commissioner and protested there. But I have yet to see a riot that manifested to the interior of someone's residence.
Yeah, and I that's next level, but I hope it never happens. Dr. Darren Porcher, former NYPD lieutenant, 20 years. Thanks for your service, Doctor.
Thanks for having me.
Wonderful to talk to you. More of our special American riots, blue cities burning. We're talking about the political ramifications on this upcoming election because of all these riots. We'll do that next. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special American Riots, Blue Cities Burning. I want to talk about what this looks like for 2020 with the senior editor of Reason magazine, Robbie Suave. Mr. Suave, how are you, brother?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, good to talk to you. So let's do presidential election. How do you see these riots, assuming they continue, affecting the presidential race?
You know, it's interesting. So far, you haven't seen them change the poll numbers for President Trump, Vice President Joe Biden so dramatically. I think it's not obvious exactly how they slot into the national picture because on one hand, Trump is certainly talking about law and order, is kind of taking the side of if you're very anti-rioter, you're very worried about them, you'd be for him. However, they're also occurring under his watch, and it's debatable what he's actually done to address it. And on the other hand, Joe Biden, despite having kind of the left in his coalition, the left being the defenders of these things, Joe Biden himself is fairly moderate and has spoken out and doesn't have a history of being like wildly pro-riot or anti-police or something like that. So actually, I don't think the national setup exactly is designed to where there would be a huge effect, since it's kind of confusing who would be for what side if you looked at it that way.
Yeah, interesting. This is clearly my bias, but I saw what happened in Kenosha, right? And you're like, Kenosha? Like, I think the fact that it was in Kenosha was super important, and not just another crazy city like Portland or whatever. But I just imagine these people in Kenosha with their Democratic governor seeing that the Democrats clearly in Kenosha and Wisconsin didn't do enough in response, that it would benefit Trump a ton. But I don't know, maybe it's not as clear as it seems to me, no?
Right. I think it's certainly possible it could benefit Trump a ton. I think under slightly different circumstances, if the Republican was the outside challenger and was making it about this, and maybe had a clearer or more well-explained plan for what they would do, I think it absolutely could be a factor. It could work against the local Democratic politicians who have utterly failed to address this, certainly. But I'm just not quite sure it affects the national race.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Unfortunately, I think that's right. You wrote an article and you had 2 studies. If we can go through those quick. The first one was called "Why Civil Resistance Works." What was the claim here?
Yeah, so this study looked at other countries where there have been protests, where there's been civil resistance, disobedience against tyrannical governments or demands made, and then also when there's been outright sort of revolutionary violence. And what they found is that when people engage in civil resistance, they're more likely to have their demands met. But when they become radical, when they become violent, then people, the masses' sympathy tends to default toward the group of people being targeted, and often it backfires. So it's a study showing that civil resistance works, kind of violent revolutionary behavior doesn't.
Yeah, it's interesting. So it says nonviolent means achieved their aims 53% of the time, and violent means worked only 26% of the time. You hear a lot of these people, obviously, who are doing this rioting, justify that violence is the only way that they can get what they want. And it does work sometimes, is the claim, right? But not all the time. Does this study go into why there's that difference?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people are only sort of just paying attention a little bit to the political landscape or the ideology or what the protesters want. But then when you cause normal people to suffer, when you destroy their small businesses, smash their windows, set their cars on fire, or their neighbors, or that goes on television. When these things are covered in a negative way, people turn against it. And even, I mean, what we're seeing in so many cities in America right now is it's not even, like they'll claim it's ideological or it's for some political purpose. But a lot of this is just opportunistic crime to me. Or people, cosplaying their kind of, Civil War fantasy type stuff. The professional protester kooks who travel from town to town. And then also just some people who are like, law and order is breaking down. Let's steal a TV. Let's loot a Target. It's almost giving them too much credit to pretend this is part of some grand design or some philosophy for social change. It absolutely is not.
Totally think that's right. We've mocked in a way. It's just a lot of cosplay, as you said, and LARPing. Just like a lot of pretend. Like you see the people with like boogie boards as shields in front of the police officers. And like my favorite was the guy who got shot. I don't know, shot by like a rubber bullet or something, I don't know. And he had like this tiny cut, and they had to put the tourniquet on his leg and stop the bleeding, and it wasn't even bleeding. It was like all pretend for these. Anyway, do you think these...
Like in sports when you're foul and you're like, oh, no, not me.
I've been thinking about this a lot, and I can't quite get this right. You and I, we're in this world, right? We live in this political, I call it the bubble, right? We're watching this stuff all the time. Is all this rioting and stuff, is it getting outside of the bubble? Are people who don't pay attention to politics seeing it? How are they interpreting it? And does that even really matter? Like, are they voting or not in the end? How do you interpret that?
I absolutely think the rioting, the violence in the streets, the harassment of people by protesters, yes, I think that is penetrating outside the bubble. And you're right, that's an important question to ask because, often we're paying attention. What did Trump say today? What are the headlines of the day? Like, I don't think Bob Woodward's book is going to change very much, going to change people's minds or affect things. But yeah, the violence is real. It's in people's communities. They're seeing that on their local television stations. I think, the economic reality caused by the pandemic and the lockdowns and the crime we're seeing, those are the two issues. Those are the only two issues to some extent. That's what people care about. Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's right. Let's go to this other study. It's by a Princeton University professor. So what did this study say about riots?
This is Omar Wassou's study. So he was looking at kind of the period of protest in the 1960s, the struggle for civil rights, that kind of thing. And he found that, again, when the demands were made peaceably, civil disobedience, that kind of thing, again, is more likely to succeed. But when the protests turned violent or unlawful, then people became more sympathetic to the very law and order tactics that the protesters oppose, that Richard Nixon skillfully exploited this to his advantage, the silent majority who was sick of kind of anarchistic violence. That's what Wiseau, and so Wiseau's warning is to liberals to please, protest. That's absolutely your right. Please protest, but don't let it degenerate into the chaos we're seeing. Interestingly enough, his research was tweeted by a Democratic kind of pollster type person at the beginning of the summer. This person saying like, so let's be careful not to descend into the violence because that turns people away. That's what this guy's job is to come up with good, sound, activist tactics for Democrats. And he was fired from his position after a social media mob of leftist people saying it was offensive and harmful to even bring up this point. So that kind of shows you the level of the interest in rational discussion and research on the progressive left.
On the Twitter bubble, that's for sure. So you mentioned Nixon. What should Trump do to, I don't want to say exploit, what's like the better word, like leverage or whatever, what's going on now to his advantage? What should he say or do?
Trump has to pick one of two strategies. He has to say, and this is his problem, he tries every strategy. He needs to say, we are happy to help. We're happy to send in the National Guard, but they have to give permission. And, it's a federalism issue. The national government doesn't control every single thing that happens in every single city. That's on them. They failed you. If they want us to help, they have to ask for our help. He does say that sometimes. But then he'll also tweet law and order and blah, blah, blah. I mean, he's so Twitter focused. I think his words seem hollow when he's just asserting that he's going to handle everything himself, and then nothing takes place. So he should pick pick one of those two strategies.
Yeah, I think that makes sense because was it Portland who said they didn't want federal help, and then when they finally did, they finally did, and then Pelosi called them stormtroopers, right? So it's definitely a can't win, but that's politics. And was it Wisconsin? Did they finally let federal troops in Wisconsin as well? Right.
So right. Yeah, but that has to be with, I think, I'm a libertarian, so I think it should be with, I don't want the federal government to just send troops everywhere if they're not wanted, if local officials haven't consented to it. So that is ultimately the sound strategy.
Oh, yeah, and I'm definitely okay with that process, no doubt about it, but he needs to make that clear, you're right. All right, Robbie Suave, Reason, read your stuff every day, man. Appreciate your work. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
Keep it up, reason.com. All right, American Riots, Blue Cities Burn. We're going to talk with Jarrett Stepman. Coming up next, we'll get a little more even big picture historical analysis of riots and looting in America. It's coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, welcome back to our special American Riots, Blue Cities Burning. I want to get a big picture historical overview with our friend Jarrett Stepman. He's from the Heritage Foundation, and he has a new book called The War on America. It's not even a year old. It still counts as new. The War on History, the conspiracy to rewrite America's past. Jarrett, how are you, brother?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I want to talk about the history of riots in America and the ramifications of it. So let's go back to, I guess, like really the beginning of America. I remember there was a couple weeks ago, some riot or protest or whatever said, this is our Boston Tea Party, and we're in the spirit of the Boston Tea Party. But my understanding is the Boston Tea Party was a shockingly, surprisingly peaceful endeavor. What do you know about it?
Yeah, that's what's really amazing about this, the comparisons. The Boston Tea Partiers didn't go through Boston looting their businesses of those who lived in Massachusetts or Boston. They had a very direct target, which was tea brought from England that couldn't be sold in Massachusetts. They very specifically targeted the tea that was a cause for all the concern over the taxes and the tariffs and whatnot. And they threw it in the harbor. They were very scrupulous about what exactly they did to the ships. I think we spoke before about how they broke the lock to get the tea, and they eventually replaced that to show that they were actually doing this in good faith, that they weren't trying to destroy private property. That was really what the Boston Tea Party was about. It was not just simply a mob going to break things, to smash things because they were angry. they had a very specific target, and they were very careful about how they showed that to the world. This was not just a disorderly mob, that this was a very specific protest to what they saw as unjust acts. And I think that's what makes it very different than what you see today, which is looting of businesses, the smashing of windows, the destruction really of property of your neighbors, of people who live in the community. I think it's a very different thing than what the Boston Tea Party was about.
Yeah, they would say, though, that this is a specific act. It's against capitalism, or it's against property. It's against white people and white supremacy. So they would say, but obviously that's not true. What historical precedent do you see going on? What's going on today?
Yeah, I think there is some connection to I think a lot of the protests, and then of course there were many riots that took place in the 1960s, the late 1960s, and early 1970s. Those, of course, eventually became quite violent. We had massive protests in Detroit in 1967, in Chicago 1968, Washington, D.C. Many of these actually became incredibly destructive, where large parts of the city, especially Washington, D.C., burned to the ground, especially after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. There was a lot of destruction. Of course, the National Guard was brought out to quell the violence in Chicago and Washington, D.C. Many of those places after this destruction didn't really recover for, I would say, decades, and really many of them never recovered. It's actually one of the stories of these protests and these, frankly, the violence that took place at that time, is that there were actually large parts of these cities that were quite prosperous that went into a long-term decline of violence, obviously anarchy, crime went through the roof, and they never really recovered economically. Many took decades. New York City, of course, only really recovered in the late 1990s, really. So I think that a lot of these protests do have connection to the 1960s and 70s. I would remind people that a lot of the devastation that takes place, a lot of destruction, things don't necessarily just go back to normal. Just because we're going to come out of a pandemic and just because things will seem to normalize doesn't mean that these parts of cities that have had a lot of violence take place, where there has been destruction, things are just going to go back to normal overnight. That really hasn't necessarily been historically the case.
Yeah, there's this wild cover they make that, well, everything's insured. These businesses are insured, so it's no big deal, right? It's like, well, first of all, not really necessarily, and not necessarily for this, and that doesn't just mean they can just pick back up like nothing happened. What has been political fallout from riots in the decades past?
Yeah, I think there has been an enormous amount of political fallout. I think this idea, and I've even heard some arguing that, well, maybe some of this looting is a good thing. It'll get people to change their minds. I would say that a lot of the looting and the burning of cities did not change many hearts and minds in this country, especially when you talk about the civil rights movement. I think it really was the appeal to, especially Americans, saying that, appeal to our founding, appeal to the Declaration. Martin Luther King Jr. was very good about this, tying the civil rights movement to the founding generation and saying that, look, you believe that all men are created equal. This is in the founding documents. Americans should change. What I don't think did convince a lot of people to embrace the cause was the destruction and violence across America. If anything, I think it created quite a reaction to this. I think when Americans, even those who are not particularly political, see their local communities burning, see a lot of destruction around them, and it looks like leaders aren't doing anything to quell that, I think there is a backlash. There was a backlash in the late 1960s. I think there will be today as well, because there are a lot of people who are looking about, and especially if you live in a place like Washington, D.C. or Chicago or any of these other places or around them, you're thinking, are my leaders really doing anything to keep me safe? Are they going to protect me when the chips are down? I mean, we talk about the Chaz or CHOP zone in Seattle. There are a lot of businesses that are suing the city saying, we were basically left on an island. You didn't help us, and a lot of those businesses, they're going to leave. A lot of the local residents are going to see this destruction and say, that's not really producing anything good. That's just making this, that's just making this place dangerous. And, we've seen crime now shoot up in cities across the country. Washington, D.C. has been hit by a rash of crime and murders. People don't like to live where it's dangerous, or it looks like it's going to be into anarchy. I think a lot of people are simply going to move out of those places they think, look, if you just look about, appear to be crumbling.
Yeah, I mean, Carville got famous for saying it's the economy stupid, but I wonder if that's like, you look at like the hierarchy of needs. I think the economy is important, but maybe just law and order is the first, right? So it's even before that. I know it's a fun thing to say, it's the economy stupid, but I think law and order is even preeminent over that. You mentioned the civil rights movement. So I just heard this argument the other day. I was reading that. Did you see that NPR interview with the woman who wrote the book In Defense of Looting? It's like this just bizarre, like, it was bizarre. But one of her arguments was, the peaceful aspect of the civil rights movement was only done to appease and appeal to northern whites. But really, the violence that was done on the ground that we don't learn about in history class, but the real violence is what actually made change in the South. I've never heard that before. Do you have any thought on that?
It's something off of another planet, frankly. It's not accurate. It didn't change any of the laws in this country. And if you really get down to it, what the argument is for looting, essentially, people should just go out and get free stuff because that'll take care of your needs. You know, a world in which you just go around taking stuff, you know, that's the law of the jungle, so to speak. That is a world in anarchy. That is a state of nature in which, at the end of the day, if that's what the whole world is composed of, then it's really just the strongest survive, the strongest who can take from their neighbors. And frankly, that's produced no strong civilizations, no strong societies. It means that those who are most at risk are probably going to be the ones who are going to be ultimately most targeted, if that's really what everything is about. I mean, and I think I think it's pretty shameful that NPR even gave cover to a book that is in defense of looting. I think it's pretty incredible, given that it's, of course, a taxpayer-funded media organization to be promoting something it's defending violence against fellow Americans. And I don't think it's ultimately helpful to anybody.
The best part is, I don't have it in front of me, but there's a copyright in the front of the book that says, you can't reprint, distribute any of this without written permission from the publisher and the author, right? So you can't steal her stuff. All right, I may put you on the spot here. And I'm not by any means making any light of the property destruction. That's livelihoods tied there, as you talked about. And I'm not making light of, gosh, we've had dozens of people killed throughout all this. David Dorn is, one name that people know, but there's many more people. There was a police officer in Vegas, who I think this was the George Floyd riots. He's paralyzed because of, I think a guy just came up and shot him in the back, or like stabbed him in the back or something, right? And he doesn't get any news. Anyway, so I'm not making light of any of that. But do you know of any situation in America where there was like, the rioting led to many, many people dying, or even, I think the next level would be attacking residential neighborhoods, and not just commercial properties, right? So do you know of any historical precedent to that, where we have lots of people killed, like slaughter, and in residential areas? That's the next step to me.
There have been a number of, there have been racial riots in this country's history. There was, New Orleans had a significant, actually, mass lynching that took place in the late 19th century. Actually, that lynching was of Italian Americans who were kept in a prison there because of a violent incident that took place. And so you have seen, I think, general lawlessness and anarchy lead to more violence in cities. Certainly, if we talk about something along the lines of an insurrection of fellow Americans, we have the most dramatic example of the Civil War, something along those lines. But as far as actually seeing cities descend into complete violence and anarchy, where there is no law and order, where people are being attacked en masse, I don't think we've seen that in American history. America.
So I wonder what. I wonder what that trigger is, or what's the thing preventing that from happening? That if is removed would happen. Does that make sense?
Americans, I think, have always been, in many regards, a very much law-abiding society. We have a constitution, we have a process whereby bad laws are changed, where you don't have to simply use violence or force to get your way. And that's, I think, something that's been very special about the United States. We've had periods where there has been, more crime, there has been more mob rule, so to speak. Abraham Lincoln denounced this in 1838, where there was a string of just vigilante justice that was occurring across the country. But I think there's always been a corrective, because Americans do have a system that is based ultimately on debate and consent. It's a system where if you don't like the laws, you can ultimately change them. You do have the power to do so without simply resorting to bullets and threatening. And I think that's what's made America a very special country. It's what's made us prosperous and successful, why people come here. I think a lot of people come here around the globe, not just for the economic opportunities, but because America has a very special legal system that protects people of all backgrounds. I think that's really the mistaken notion, especially those who are defending looting and things like this. You know, these laws to defend property and things like this, they're not there to defend the strong. They're there to defend the weak and those who will be targeted. I mean, that's what's made America special, so that people of all different backgrounds can rise up in this country. And I think that, you know, we have a lot of these arguments against it. I think it's going to hurt even many of the people they claim to be defending. I think are going to be harmed by the general breakdown of law and order.
Yep. Let's end it on that hopeful note. That's perfect. The War on History, the Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. Jarrett Stepman from the Heritage Foundation. Jarrett, always good to talk to you, brother. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much.
Really good, man. American Riots, Blue Cities Burning. Mike Slater, spread the word.